Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first episode of Zach's Library. Today, I will be reviewing The Shadow of the Sun by Ryszard Kapuscinski. So, some background on the author. He was a Polish journalist under the communist regime, started in 1957, and he was sent to Africa in order to observe and report on the independence movements, which were starting to flare up around the time. He did eventually lose his job because he supported Solidarity, but it was in the 80s, so the book encompasses 4 decades starting in around 1960 all the way up to 2000. Quick summary, the book is kind of split up into different vignettes as he reports on different countries and different times, and they're not too connected as to his entire story of Africa, but they are connected through theme. So he starts in Ghana, which was in 1960 among the first African nations to declare independence. He talks about his experience with kind of the bright, European educated, but really African nationalists that were emerging there, such as Kwame Nkrumah. He speaks to his Minister of Education named Kofi Bako, who really had an optimistic view of how African independence would go, and that was more or less the story of the 60s, as he later goes to Zanzibar. It takes a roundabout way of getting there. Zanzibar was at the time made up of about 20% Arabs and 80% Africans from the continent, so there was more or less just a popular revolt that kicked out many of the Arabs, and that also had parallels later in the century with the Rwandan genocide, with the Hutus massacring the Tutsis, who were the landowning class, and obviously they took it further than it was taken in Zanzibar, but there are parallels. He also reports on the Nigerian coup in 1966, which just a year before the Civil War takes out there. It was kind of a rude awakening of sorts as far as how an independent Africa would end up looking, and that really takes shape in the 70s and 80s as he visits both Uganda and Ethiopia, as they're under the rule of Idi Amin and Mengistu, respectively. There's really a totalitarian wave that comes across Africa politically during this time. Obviously, it was a battleground in the Cold War. Ethiopia was itself a communist nation under Mengistu. By the 90s, there is somewhat of a new dawn. So Kapuscinski spoke with this emissary, and he said that he believed that infrastructure was the way to end hunger, because there was not at all a shortage of food, but rather the way that food was taken to Africa, it was not very conducive to just the layout of Africa, and there weren't enough roads to access many of the villages, and those that were very poorly kept. Oftentimes humanitarian groups would send in planes or helicopters to the cities of regions in need, but as soon as they landed, they'd be either stolen by some other militant group or just not distributed very well. Aside from all the politics, Kapuscinski does a really good job of observing the people and the culture, which in Africa is rather communal, but it's also variable throughout the continent. There are some common themes, though, such as the importance of faith and belief in the power of ancestors, which still persists today, even in, it might be a Muslim country or a Christian country in Africa, but there are animist beliefs fused with all of those. European systems cannot be mapped onto Africa. That is a big theme of this book, and really made me think a lot while I was reading it. There was one quote near the end that Europe didn't partition Africa as much as causing like a bloody unification of like the 10,000 tribes into about 50 countries. All right. Synthesis. This book is 2 decades old. Obviously, it only went up until 2000s, but I do believe it is still relevant today. Obviously, China and the US and the rest of Europe are kind of battling to build infrastructure inside of Africa. Regardless of your opinion on China, what they're doing is still building jobs and infrastructure, and it's making transport of food easier, which really battles the hunger crisis on 2 different fronts. Speaking of hunger, here's a little food for thought. So, one of the chapters, Kapuscinski visits Liberia, and in Liberia, there were 2 very distinct classes, which were really like in the proportions of 1% and 99%. But the 1% on top were the Americo-Liberians, who were former slaves and descendants of former slaves who were moved over during around the 1820s up until the Civil War. But the problem was that these Americo-Liberians only knew slavery, and they'd been away from Africa, their families had been away from Africa so long that they were not culturally African anymore. And so, given the chance, they built society in the image of the American South, but put themselves on top this time. So my question for you in the comments is slavery/oppression self-sustaining? Can we stop it without altering human nature, whatever that means? And that's all I have for you today. So again, the book is The Shadow of the Sun by Ryszard Kapuscinski. I'll lend a copy to anyone if you're interested. I do recommend it.